Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thanks, Bob Kincaid. Thank you very much, and welcome to a Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the 29th day of December. It is a Tuesday, and it is a pleasure to be with you on what has turned out to be, at least here in this portion of the Southeast, an absolutely gorgeous day. There were forecasts of the possibility of the sun breaking out this afternoon. Well, it broke out this morning, and it's an absolutely gorgeous day. And what makes it extra special is that it's something that none of us really expected. So I didn't expect it. So it's kind of a little bit of a prize, kind of a New Year's prize, so to speak, thrown in the middle of the final week of the year 2015. Thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be with you on this, our second day of broadcasting at the Virtual Center. I do trust that all's going well and that you're enjoying the festivities of the holiday and that everything is going well. If you are a new listener and haven't been with us before, I do encourage you to get in touch with us, and I'm going to give you 2 or 3 ways to do that in a moment. And let us know what you think, and let us know if there are things that you think we might do to improve our broadcast and improve our programming. If you indeed do enjoy it, we would love to hear that as well. And if you don't, we would appreciate hearing why. We have a phone number that is available for you. It'll get you on the air, and we do encourage you to feel comfortable calling in the middle of the program. It is a live interactive opportunity. It gives all of us the opportunity to exchange ideas and opinions and suggestions and questions and all the rest of it. And I do encourage you to really take advantage of the opportunity. The phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate with me via email, and of course I know a number of folks do because they don't want to go on the air, and I can surely understand that, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN, 906, all one word, no punctuation, at gmail.com. And again, I would like to let you know that we do have a Facebook page. We've had it now for about 3 months, I guess. If you go to Facebook and you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will be on our Facebook page. And on that page, over the last several weeks, I have posted a number of entries. Last evening, for example, I put a post on there which I thought pretty well it was an effort to try to capture some of yesterday's program and put it in print for not only for those who were with us yesterday and might want an opportunity to copy and paste and keep a record of it, and for those that were not with us yesterday, I put it on Facebook hoping that people would become interested and might become regular listeners here at the Virtual Center. So again, if you go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will gain access to our Facebook page. And again, I do appreciate your input in whatever form it might come. I do solicit your ideas, your comments, your questions, your suggestions. I appreciate those very, very much. Obviously, I like the comments that are positive, but to be very honest with you, I like the ones that are negative as well, because more often than not, they reflect a level of consideration and thought that make them worthy of serious consideration, and I do appreciate that. Last evening, as I mentioned, I was looking for something to put on Facebook, and I wanted to try to capture a little bit of yesterday's program. And as often happens with me, and I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but it's something that I've learned to live with. When I begin to write something, I find that the text itself, the subject itself, tends to write itself for me. It takes me in directions that seem quite logical when they come up, but they are ideas and directions that I had no idea of when I first began to sit down and write. And last evening was a case in point. I thought that I would follow suggestion that was given to me by one of our listeners, that I post the paragraph in John Locke's first treatise on government related to charity, since I had quoted it for 2 days, our last program last week and then again yesterday. I basically read the particular paragraph in question and talked quite a bit about the issue of charity and the changes in that term from the late 17th century when John Locke wrote about it until today, when the word charity is very, very familiar to most of us. But there has been, and that was the point of one of the points in yesterday's program, was the fact that word has experienced a major change, and very few of us appreciate that. That what we consider today as charity totally focuses on the giver. And for religious and moral reasons and ethical reasons and everything else, people are encouraged to do what they can for for those less fortunate. And it's one of the things that makes our society, it seems to me, as pleasant for most folks as we can make it. When you look at charity the way Locke used it, however, it was quite a bit different, because Locke's position was that those who were in dire need, he didn't say this, but this is the implication, didn't need to wait on the kindness of people, the benevolence of people, to provide them what they needed. That as members of a community, people in desperate need had a right to take what they needed from those who had more than they needed, from what he called the surplusage of those who had excess. And we talked a little bit about what kind of a society it would be if people continued to subscribe to that definition of charity. And then we talked about, well, let's presume for a second that indeed people who in need did have the right to take what they needed from those who had it and didn't seem to be using it or taking advantage of it. And the question then would become, how do we address that particular problem? Because it sure would be a problem. And of course, the issue would be, from the perspective of those governing that particular community or that particular society, the solution would be to make sure that nobody was ever in that kind of dire distress. And of course, the fact of the matter is, if people genuinely practiced what they preached, so to speak, nobody would be. And I think that applied in Locke's day as much or perhaps even more today. But be that as it may, we talked about that. One of our listeners suggested that I post that paragraph on Facebook. So when I sat down last evening, that was my original intent, was to post that paragraph. And then I thought, well, maybe I ought to just put something on there about today's program. It's an opportunity to gain some visibility on Facebook. It's an opportunity to put some of the major ideas that had occurred come up in yesterday's program in print for others to see, and it could be a possibility for those who weren't with us to become listeners, participants in our virtual center programs. So I started to write, and as I began to do it, I began to summarize some of the thinking, some of the information material about John Locke that we talked about yesterday. And it occurred to me that there might be a way to present it which would make it, make sense to people, and put it in such a way that it would be something that folks could get their arms around, as it were, because it's very abstract. The whole idea of the state of nature is an abstraction to begin with. And it's all imagined. It's all conceptual in John Locke's mind. And so basically it's based on the premise. If one were to imagine a state in which everybody was free to do whatever came naturally, there was no government, there were no rules, there were no written laws, people were ultimately thrown into a situation where they had to find ways to survive and get along, and get along in their own lives, but more importantly, to survive and get along with other people who were in exactly the same situation they were. What kind of a state, what kind of a situation would such a place be? And that's really the premise on which John Locke's entire thesis is developed. So it's abstract and conceptual from the very beginning. So as we begin to play around with different ideas and compare and contrast different ideas, it's important to recognize that we're doing it in an atmosphere of abstraction, so to speak. It's a what if kind of situation, an imaginary mystical situation, kind of the situation that a really good novel or a really good movie will get us into, where we actually become a participant in the story, and we forget that we're watching a facet of life for other people, but in effect it becomes something that we're actually a participant in ourselves. And of course, that's the goal for anybody who writes, is to write so well that people find it easy to engage and feel that they are a part of the action, so to speak. That's essentially what Locke's theory is about. And it dawned on me, and I had mentioned in a previous program, a couple of programs ago, that 2 weekends ago I had spent some time on Saturday afternoon looking at Euclid's Elements of Geometry. And the reason for that was I was looking at the strategy or the presentation. I had read a source, and I won't go into all of this, but I read a source which suggested that if you wanted to go back to the very beginning and understand mathematics the way it was originally intended, the best place to begin is with Euclid's Elements. And he presents it in a series of what ifs. He posits certain things. If this is true, then that's true. If those two things are true, then this must be true, etc. And he takes you through a step-by-step process where we begin to reason and get into the material in a way which most of us can handle. It's presented in such a way that it makes perfect sense. And it's almost like learning to walk. One step follows logically on the previous step and leads logically to the next one. And I thought, God, you could kind of do that with John Locke. So last evening on Facebook, I set out to do exactly that. And I'm looking for I made a copy of what I put on Facebook for purposes of today's program for this particular review. So I'm going to kind of run way through this, but I want to make the points that I was talking about. Just keep Euclid's Elements of Geometry in mind. And I opened up with this introduction and said, John Locke, as we know, wrote two treatises on government in the late 17th century. The first one, an attack on the legitimacy of absolute government. The second, a case for representative government based upon natural rights, popular consent, and contract theory. It's the latter one, the second treatise, that many believe to be the model for the more abstract elements of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. The Declaration's self-evident truths were the philosophical substance of what thinking men believed to be the essence of legitimate government. That was Jefferson's whole premise, is that these introductory paragraphs of the Declaration were his efforts to lay out exactly what educated thinking people at the time believed to be true about government and man's relation to it and its relationships to its own citizens. And he even called these self-evident truths. And so basically, from Locke's perspective in the Declaration, this was the basis, the what I call the philosophical substance of what thinking people believed was the essence of legitimate government. The rest of the Declaration, as we know, was his case for specific violation after violation committed by the Crown, committed by Parliament, which violated those principles, those self-evident principles. And Jefferson's whole point was that by piling up the violations, he in effect was justifying the right of the colonies to declare independence from the mother country. In fact, he was doing even more than claiming the right to do it. He was basically suggesting that the colonies had no choice but to do it. And so the burden for revolution was on the mother country, not the colonies. That was Jefferson's whole point, because they had violated these self-evident truths. And of course, this whole idea summarizes a substantial portion of John Locke's second treatise. Because when he wrote his treatises, he was justifying the glorious revolution in England. He was justifying the right of Parliament to oust the King of England, oust absolute government, in order to replace it with representative government. So Locke's situation in the late 17th century was the same situation that the colonists found themselves in 1776. And so it stood to reason for most people that Locke's situation, the context within which he wrote and how he did it, was very, very useful to Jefferson because the situations were so similar. And that becomes the bulk of that is really the overall outline of Jefferson's Declaration. And there's no question that the overall framework of Locke's argument in his second treatise on civil government matches quite closely Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Jefferson changed the word natural rights to unalienable rights. We know that. Many claim that he changed property to pursuit of happiness as well. That one we've spent some time over the last couple of weeks focusing on. Because of an examination, a check of the sources tells us that that's questionable, whether in fact that's what Jefferson was doing, was replacing the word property with the idea of pursuit of happiness. That in effect, happiness to Jefferson had its own distinct meaning. And that particular meaning was much closer to benevolence than it was to self-gratification. In other words, happiness in Jefferson's mind was much more about what you could do for other people than what you could or should do for yourself. To Jefferson, then, happiness was a hell of a lot more. I didn't say this in my writing. I guess I'm elaborating a little bit. Happiness to Jefferson was much more than merely a rhetorical synonym for the word property. And that's the point I wanted to make. What we have found in our examinations over the last couple of programs, our examinations of Locke, is that what becomes particularly interesting in Locke are not so much the ideas that are always talked about, that are always discussed and written about, the ideas related to natural rights, to the laws of nature, to the right of revolution, to contract theory, to the idea that people can only be held accountable for laws that they consent to obey. Those things we understand. That's what we're taught about Jefferson's Declaration, and that's directly attributable in large part to John Locke. We know that. But what has become particularly interesting about Locke are issues or areas of interest that many of us never even knew existed in Locke. Concepts like community, common good, limitations on the right to acquire private property, the rights of the poor, the idea of charity. Those things in John Locke are issues that are rarely discussed when talking about Locke. And what we have found is that those things bring to the front, put on the table, raise the kinds of questions about Locke that it seems to me make it necessary to reconsider the total philosophical basis of Locke's treatises. In other words, these things add so much to our understanding and appreciation of the depth of John Locke's thinking that, in my case, I become somewhat uncomfortable with the fact that for so long I was really unfair to John Locke because everything I considered or discussed or taught when I was teaching college classes about John Locke and about his theory were based on the common things that we know from his second treatise. Because it's abstract, it called for attention, it called for explanation, it called for clarification, and I did that. But as far as digging into Locke, into those areas which have kind of disappeared from our view, the things about Locke that none of us even bothered to look for or knew were there, I really paid little, if any, attention at all. And I feel a little bit uncomfortable about that. Because one of the things that we've discussed here, and one of the issues that has become very clear to me, is that a very serious reconsideration of John Locke's entire philosophy seems to be in order. Such an examination, or re-examination, if you will, or reconsideration, is one that those who are committed to John Locke, the John Locke that we all know, would resist vehemently. Because the John Locke we know fits perfectly into the world his committed supporters want us to subscribe to, which is the idea of free enterprise capitalism and the sanctity of private property. That's the world that the most committed followers of John Locke want to subscribe to. So if you start introducing a whole new set of concepts and ideas and theories about John Locke that are liable to affect and change the John Locke that we currently know, people are going to resist that like crazy. But the fact of the matter is John Locke's emphasis on community, it seems to me, screams for attention. And I think in today's program, as we examine John Locke's writings on property, we're going to appreciate just how loudly John Locke's concept of property demands consideration of the idea of community. Everything that John Locke says, he frames in such a way that he is justifying the right to privatize property and not negatively impact the lives of the rest of the people in the community. And the fact that he spends so much time justifying the right of the few to privatize elements of the commons, elements of what is commonly owned by everybody, by the community at large, the fact that he devotes so much attention to justifying it suggests that to him, community is critically important. And to him, it's vital that everything that the private property owner does to benefit himself not harm the rest of the community in which he lives. If it does, Locke says, then that privatization cannot happen, should not happen. So Locke is putting a premium on community, a premium on the welfare of all, what we call the common good. And whatever happens in the area of private property, Locke insists, cannot or should not have a negative impact on the common good. Of course, we know, and Locke tells us, that the only law in the state of nature is reason, man's common sense. Man's common sense, Locke argues, will tell him what he can do and what he can't do, what he should do and what he should not do. By implication, then, what Locke is saying, that if man's common sense tells him that privatizing the particular piece of the commons that a person has in mind is going to negatively impact the rest of the community, the other people around him, then his common sense tells him he should not do that. But we know, and Locke tells us over and over again in the second treatise, that there's nobody to enforce that common sense. If man chooses to ignore it and to take what he wants to take, irregardless or irrespective of what impact it has on other people, then there's nothing to stop him except the people to whom he's doing it. In other words, except the people who are being harmed. What that means is that in the law of nature, the only way to enforce the law is the people themselves have to do it. And that, Locke believes, is not a good situation. It is not conducive to progress. It's not conducive to peace. It's not conducive to harmony. It's not conducive to stability. And it has the implications of creating a time of discord within the state of nature, which benefits no one. Locke's whole point then in the second treatise is that that's the reason man's common sense tells him that there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a more convenient way. And man concludes that convenient way is to create government, is to agree to give up a portion of his freedom in the state of nature in exchange for the security and the stability that a government limited in power to the protection of man's natural rights to life, liberty, and property would provide. In other words, to Locke, that's really the justification for the social contract. The social contract is that when man willingly gives up, surrenders his freedoms, some of his freedoms, in the state of nature, in exchange for the security and the stability that governments will provide. But he makes it very clear that government's role, government's part of the contract, is to provide by the specified powers given it, which is the power to protect people's life, liberty, and property. So that's really the essence of where we are. The new thing, the thing that makes that different than most of us who have studied Locke and read Locke have focused on before, is the issue of community. Because Locke never mentions the word community. He's talking about a situation where people are individuals. They're not part of an organized group, which we call community. And the fact of the matter is, everything that is provided for this in the state of nature is provided by God to all. In other words, everything is commonly owned. There is no private property. There is no sense of, there is no private ownership. What belongs to one belongs to all. What Locke's chapter on property sets out to do is justify privatizing portions of that commons and doing it in a way which does not negatively impact the commons or the other people that have a right to it and in fact own it. He's justifying the right of private property within a community or a communal type of arrangement, which is the state of nature. And what dawned on me, and here this is the Euclid's Elements of Geometry piece that I mentioned in the introduction. It dawned on me that a way to clarify all of this might be to lay it out kind of in this way. If this be true, then that must be the result. That kind of a scenario, that's the way Euclid enters the discussion of geometry in his Elements of Geometry. So this is what I came up with, and I wanted to share it with you because it constitutes review, it constitutes good information for people that maybe couldn't be with us before. And for those who have been here with us and have been, have been participants in this over the last couple of programs, it kind of provides a way to put it all into a context, which seems to make some sense. So here I go. Let's see if this makes sense. Point 1. John Locke said that man's right to private property in the state of nature, parentheses, from that held in common by all, exists under very specific limitations or qualifications. Limitations created by what makes sense, man's reason. For in the state of nature, man's reason stands as the law of nature. So the first point that we've touched on is that Locke is making the point that man's right to private property is not unlimited. It is not a freedom or a right to do whatever you want or take as much as you want of what's there. Locke includes very specific limitations or qualifications on the right to private property. First one, no man can claim more than he can use. Only that which becomes his own, because he is able to mix his own labor with it. You have a right to what your labor is mixed with, what you can use, and no more. Second, no man has a right to take so much that much of what he claims to be his own ends up spoiled, rotted, or has become putrid. In other words, he uses the example, we'll see it in a moment when we look at the document itself. He talks about acorns. And if you're collecting acorns, Locke is saying you have a right to as many acorns as you can use. But you don't have a right to just throw in, take containers and pick up every available acorn that's there so that nobody else can get any. And the fact of the matter is, if you did pick up that many acorns, way more than you could use, you couldn't use them and they would rot. They would become no good. That means that they would be denying the benefits to other people of those acorns. You can't do that, Locke says. And the third limitation, no man has a right to claim property unless there remains for others, Locke says, and this is a quote, enough and as good as what he intends to take from the commons. The only way that you are justified in privatizing a portion of the commons is when you can assure folks that you are leaving enough for everybody else and that what you are taking does not negatively impact anybody else. Those are the three limitations. So in a sense then, Locke says, yeah, man has a right to private property, but within the following limits. Number one, number two, number three. All right, now to my second point. If we accept this content as an accurate reflection of what John Locke truly believes, then what follows has to be true as well, based on common sense. First, if reason tells man that what he claims to be his own, because he has mixed his labor with it, will prove detrimental to others and thus become unreasonable, then his reason, his common sense is telling him that the welfare of all must take precedence over the welfare of individuals. If you take what Locke says literally, then this is true. Namely, that if man takes what he chooses because he's labored on it, he's expended his own labor, mixed his own labor with it, and his common sense, his reason tells him that if he does this, it's going to be detrimental to other people, then reason is telling him that the welfare, the best interests of all, must be a priority over the interests of single individuals. That makes sense. Second, this is also true. If that's true, that the welfare of all should take precedence over the welfare of individuals, if that's true, then what we might term a community does indeed exist in Locke's state of nature. He doesn't use the word, but it does. Not only does it exist, but its welfare, what's best for it, outweighs the wants of individuals in the state of nature. All of this is totally contradictory to the common interpretation of Locke as being focused exclusively on the rights and the natural rights of individuals. What makes this significant is that in our textbooks, in our schools, in our lectures, in our classrooms, in our colleges, in all of our textbooks, John Locke is presented as a defender of individual rights, natural rights. That's what he's all about. The rights of the individual ought not to be infringed. But when you read Locke, he doesn't say that at all. He says the rights of the individual must always be weighed against the welfare of the many, of the others. He doesn't call the others a community, but the fact of the matter is that's exactly what they are. And so, in a sense, what we've looked at here is a different John Locke than most of us have ever been exposed to before. We didn't even know this John Locke existed. And of course, the issue we've been focusing on is why. The third thing that seems to be the next logical point made, if that's true, and that is that community does in fact exist and should take precedence over the rights of individuals. If that's true, and if, as Locke tells us, man chooses to leave the state of nature and set up government as a better, more efficient means to protect his natural rights to life, liberty, and property, then that means that government created under this social contract can do more than simply protect individual rights. This is important. If there is community, and if its priorities take precedence over individual priorities, then it stands to reason that once man chooses to leave the state of nature and enter into the social contract and create a government to protect his natural rights to life, liberty, and property, the government that is created can do more than just protect individual rights. Besides its defined limited role as protector of natural rights, one must conclude, reason tells us, it only makes sense, it's logical to conclude that the government that is created by the social contract is empowered with the same obligation to consider the common good, the welfare of the community, against individual rights when it appears that these rights will have a detrimental impact on the community at large. It doesn't make sense to conclude that man's reason told him that there are limits on the rights to private property in the state of nature. But when man leaves the state of nature and government is created to protect his property, it doesn't stand to reason that his rights to property suddenly become absolute and unlimited. It doesn't make sense. Locke wouldn't do that. It only makes sense. It only stands to reason that the government Locke creates under the social contract would have the same authority, the same power that reason had in the state of nature. The only difference is government in society would have the power of enforcement. Government could enforce its will. In the state of nature, man's reason could not be enforced, except by each individual. So in a sense, then, the arguments that our textbook give us, that Jefferson's and Locke's definition of limited government is solely to protect man's natural rights, is untrue. Included also is government's responsibility to govern for the common good, the welfare of the many. And if it was true in the state of nature that man could not privatize property, if it was detrimental to the welfare of others, then it stands to reason that in organized society under government, the same limitations, the same qualifications would apply. It's common sense. It's reason. And the fact of the matter is, reason is the basis of Locke's whole philosophy. Point 3. It only makes sense that government, created to fulfill what reason alone could not fulfill conveniently and efficiently in the state of nature, that government would inherit at least as much power and oversight as man's reason had prior to the social contract. Without question, then, that power must include the responsibility to promote the common good. A common good that included an obligation to manage or to regulate the distribution of private property in the public interest. Private property is not an absolute right. Private property is not an unalienable right, says John Locke. Private property must always be weighed against the best interests of the community at large. That's the way it was in the state of nature. That's the way it must be under the social contract in civil society. By implication, then, the power to regulate the distribution of private property would also include the power to redistribute that property if the common good demanded such a redistribution. If elements of privatization, private property, were doing harm to the community at large, were detrimental to the common good, then government's responsibility in the name of the common good, in the name of, and under the Constitution, the preamble to our United States Constitution, to promote the general welfare, would demand that government do whatever it must do to address the problem. And if the problem is a maldistribution or unequal distribution of private property to the detriment of the community at large, then government's right to redistribute that property in order to serve the best interests of the common, of the public, is justified. Final point. We hear all the time about the dangers and the evils of socialism and communism. And the definition of those, the worst thing that communism, socialism, whatever you choose to call it, would do to our freedom is redistribute private property, violate the Declaration of Independence, violate man's unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Basically, what this analysis of Locke proves is that all of those arguments, all of those boogeymen associated with redistribution of property, all of it is bogus. In fact, John Locke himself saw that need as necessary to government's effectiveness upon man's leaving the state of nature. If government couldn't do that, then the reason that man chose to leave the state of nature would not be successful. Why would man leave an inconvenient situation in which he was free? Why would he give up some of that freedom to enter a situation where there was chaos, where for the many there was nothing. There was no hope, there was no opportunity, there was no property left, because the few were being given the privilege of taking it all. If I sound like Bernie Sanders here, it's because that in large part is what Bernie Sanders is telling us. They have to be told, they have to learn that they can't have it all. John Locke, the father, the godfather, if you will, of individual freedom and private property, himself insisted that there must be limitations on private property. Always, what private property entails must be weighed against the best interests of the community at large. And those who challenge this, and I'm thinking specifically in the last election for president, Mitt Romney, who argued that to penalize success would be a violation of what America stands for. It would be a violation of the freedoms that independence provided for us. That argument is bogus. And John Locke says so. Locke knew that the unregulated accumulation of private property by a few would disrupt the stability and the harmony of the state of nature. It would disrupt the stability and harmony of any community. It was a possibility in nature. One must conclude that nothing changed once a society under government was created by compact. And the inequality that threatens our society today proves that John Locke's fears were indeed well placed. That, I think, is pretty much a summary of what our last couple of programs here at the Virtual Center have been focused on. I believe that it's quite significant. I believe that it demonstrates that going back to the sources and reading the actual sources brings to the fore issues and concepts and perspectives that have heretofore been buried, submerged, suppressed, hidden, whatever you want it to call it. Please understand, I know that Mitt Romney and the other names that I've mentioned are not in-depth readers of John Locke's philosophies. I mean, it would be naive to presume that. That basically what they are all doing is speaking from the perspective of what the others who agree with them say. And if they say it often enough and loud enough, it becomes true. We know that. But the fact of the matter is, by saying it often enough and loud enough, they are convincing the rest of us that indeed it is true. And the evidence suggests that it clearly is not true. There's no way that Bernie Sanders could successfully run for president of the United States by quoting passages from John Locke. None of us, it seems to me, are naive enough to believe that. But the fact of the matter is, what we are finding in John Locke seems to support many of the positions and the arguments that Bernie Sanders is making. And the fact that his ideas are having the impact they are on the campaign. There's no question that they have forced Hillary to assume a bit more liberal positions than she would than she would be willing to endorse were he not in the race. But now it's becoming clear that even Donald Trump is beginning to buy into, and I guess what I need to say is steal, co-opt some of these arguments because Bernie Sanders is pulling such crowds. I really believe that this is incredibly important. What it does for me is validate the importance of education. And it suggests to me that if we can get our kids early enough to begin to address and to deal realistically and cognitively with a number of these concepts and principles, the results would be astounding. I have to believe that that's part of the reason why so many people are frightened by the Common Core. But that, again, it seems to me, is another issue. So where does all of this stuff lie? Where is the evidence for all of this stuff? Well, lo and behold, it's in John Locke's second treatise on civil government. And if you look online, this is online. All of it is on. You can get the entire documents online, both the first treatise and the second treatise. And the paragraph on charity from the first treatise is in chapter 4 of the first treatise. In chapter 5 of his second treatise on civil government, John Locke addresses the issue of property. All of it is here in this chapter. Now, this chapter does not go into the idea of the social compact and the limitations on government and all the rest of it. Those are the future chapters. But John Locke's effort to justify private property is in chapter 4, and there's in chapter 5. And there's absolutely no question but that John Locke is advocating the priorities and the principles of, in his day, what we call the middle class, the emerging business community, the emerging capitalistic commercial community that was becoming so powerful and so influential in England by the late 17th century. This was a group of people who were engaged in trading, in overseas trade. These were the people that invested and funded the ventures that planted the colonies, not only in America, the 13 colonies, but as we know, England had colonies all over the world, in Asia and Southeast Asia, in India, etc., etc. And the money, the capital that was being invested in those ventures, in those pursuits of wealth, as it were, around the world, was being generated by an emerging, growing, more powerful, more influential middle class business community. Investors, insurance, shippers, shipmakers, and people involved in timber, processing timber and iron ore and all of these other things. Locke is writing for them. Locke is basically justifying the right of the middle classes of the business community to participate as an equal partner in political decision making. Because up to that time, the absolute power of the king was lined up or allied with the landed nobility of England's medieval past. The large landed nobles was the major basis of support for the crown. The Glorious Revolution was the overthrow of the king and the emergence of Parliament as the priority decision maker in British government. A parliament that represented the people of England. A parliament that was dominated by this period by the emerging business community, the middle class. In other words, the Glorious Revolution was a play for political power by the middle classes who had the economic power, but they didn't have the political clout to fulfill or carry out what they needed and wanted. And the only way they could do it was to get rid of the king. John Locke's treatises on government are his effort to justify the right of this new business community to participate in decision-making in English government, in English politics. That's the background. So there's no question that if John Locke is defending or writing in behalf of the business community, the middle classes, that he's going to be a supporter of private property, of private investment. He has to be. His problem is, or his challenge is, he's got to justify the taking of private property within the traditional idea that God created the world for the benefit of all people and everybody owned it equally. In other words, Locke's problem in defending the business community or the middle class is the fact that it contradicted the idea that everything that existed was part of the commons, was there for the benefit of everybody. And now suddenly these people claim the right to take portions of it. Locke's job, Locke's intent in chapter 5 of his second treatise is to justify privatization by demonstrating that it doesn't necessarily have to be at the expense of anybody else. That in effect, if it is, then he agrees it ought not to happen. So he's not talking about absolute powers, absolute rights to private property at all. He's talking about limited rights to private property. And he begins chapter 5 by going back to the beginning. And he poses the possibility that can be either or of two things that created the world we live in. Whether we consider natural reason or whether we look at religious origins, at revelation, the fact of the matter is, most people believe that the earth, the world, was given to mankind in common. And he says at the end of his first paragraph, he talks about God giving the world to Adam and to his heirs in succession. And then he closes the first paragraph by saying the following: But I shall endeavor to show how men might come to have a property in several parts of that which God gave to mankind in common, and that without any express compact of all the commoners. In other words, what I am setting out to show in this chapter is that man can privatize property and not harm other people in doing it. That's his challenge. I ask you to think about this. That challenge is evidence, is proof that Locke is not ignoring community. In fact, he's given community priority attention. Because everything individuals can do to privatize must always be weighed against the impact that it will have on other people. In chapter 26 of in section 26 of chapter 4. Locke says the following: God, who hath given the world to men in common, hath also given them reason to make use of it to the best advantage of life and convenience. The implication here, and where Locke is going, is what he's saying is God created the world and gave it to man for his use, but he intended that it be used. And then what Locke is going to argue is privatizing it is really the only way to turn it from not useful property into useful property. And he goes on to say that no body has originally a private dominion exclusive of the rest of mankind, as they are thus in their natural state. Yet being given for the use of men, there must of necessity be a means to appropriate them some way or other before they can be of any use. In other words, the idea is there needs to be privatization if the property held in, if what is given to man in common is to prove useful. What he's saying is if it remains common property, nobody develops it. So by definition, the only way to get it developed, which benefits all mankind, Locke is implying, is to permit somehow the process of privatization to happen. In the next paragraph, section 27, he says, though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. Locke is suggesting here that your life, you yourself, your body, your life is your property. Every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his own. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. So if you mix your labor with a portion of the commons, that portion becomes yours, Locke says. By your labor annexes something to it that excludes the common right of other men. In other words, once you mix your labor with a portion of the commons, it becomes yours. And the fact that it becomes yours means it's off limits to everybody else. And of course, the power of reason in the state of nature, Locke believes, would tell other people, this is yours, don't touch. And of course, Locke's argument is there's nothing wrong with that. And then he uses the example of acorns. And he said, he that is nourished by the acorns he picked up under an oak, or the apples he gathers from the trees in the woods, has certainly appropriated them to himself. In other words, if you pick up acorns that have fallen on the ground, or you pick up apples that have fallen on the ground, they're yours. Nobody can deny, Locke says, but the nourishment is his. Then he says, I ask then, when did they begin to be his? When he ate them? When he boiled them? When he brought them home? When he picked them up? It's plain, he said, if the first gathering made them not his, nothing else would. In other words, the mere fact that he collected the acorns, at that point they became his. By picking them up, you added something to them more than nature, the common mother of all, had done. And so they became his private right. And will anyone say he had no right to those acorns or those apples? Was it robbery to assume to himself what belonged to all in common? He said if people needed the community's consent to pick up apples off the ground, then everybody would starve. We see in the commons then, Locke says, by compact, that it is the taking any part of what is common and removing it out of the state nature leaves it in, which begins the property. Let me stop here. If such a consent as that was necessary, man had starved, Locke says, notwithstanding the plenty God had given him. In other words, if God created apples on the ground and acorns on the ground, but man had to get permission to pick them up, then in the midst of plenty, man would starve. We see in commons, which remain so by compact, that it is the taking any part of what is common and removing it out of the state nature leaves it in, which begins the property. Which begins the property. This, I believe, is critically important. Because when Locke says that the actual picking up of the apples is the beginning of property, what he's saying is that property doesn't exist until it's privatized. So long as the world is owned in common by everybody, so long as it's part of the commons, it's not property. It only becomes property when it becomes private. What that means is that Locke is telling us that the concept or the idea of property changes with privatization. It moves from the unalienable to the alienable. Once it's privatized, property becomes something quite different than when it existed before it was privatized. Once it's privatized, it can be fenced in. It can be valued. It can be taxed. It can be inherited. It can be put in your will for your son or whatever. It can be handed down to the next generation. It can be taxed. In other words, once property is privatized, it changes from its unalienable state, which is potential to be privatized, to its actual state of alienability. That fact disproves the whole idea of conservatives that property is one of Jefferson's unalienable rights. Because in order to argue that property is included in the unalienable rights after the social contract is created, then you are trying to argue that property remains unalienable even though it's alienable. You own it. But now you're saying, I own it, but it can't be taxed, or it can't be more heavily taxed in the benefit to the benefit of the common interest. In other words, government can't control it, manage it, regulate it because it's mine and it's unalienable. No, it is not. Once it is privatized, it ceases to be unalienable. It becomes alienable and therefore subject to the regulation of government. And arguments to the contrary are bogus. They are in total denial of John Locke himself. And John Locke's argument or chapter on property is the basis of the whole natural rights philosophy position. So those four words, which begins the property, is John Locke telling us that a change in state happens with privatization. And those who would deny that have John Locke to deal with. He goes on and says, which begins the property, without which the commons is of no use. And the taking of this or that part does not depend on the express consent of all the commoners. The labor that was mine, removing them out of that common state they were in, hath fixed my property in them. In other words, once I mix my labor with it, it becomes mine. It changes from everybody's property to my property. It becomes alienable. Another example, Locke says, of this. Though the water running in the fountain be everyone's, who can doubt but that in the picture is his only who drew it out? If there's a fountain, the water coming out of the fountain belongs to everybody. But if I go up to the fountain with a pitcher and I fill it, then what's in that pitcher is mine, not everybody's. It becomes mine. And if it's worth money, I can sell it. If it's worth money, government can tax it. It has become alienable once I make it mine. Thus, this is section 30 in chapter 4. Locke says, thus this law of reason makes the deer that Indians who have killed it. It is allowed to be his goods, who have bestowed his labor upon it, though before it was the common right of everyone. In other words, as long as the deer was running through the forest, it belonged to everyone. But when I kill it, it becomes mine, which means it no longer belongs to everyone. And I have the right to defend it from you if you try to take it. Then Locke goes from the deer running through the woods and he talks about the fish in the ocean. What fish anyone catches in the ocean, that great and still remaining common of mankind, is by labor that removes it out of that common state nature left it in, made his property who takes that pains about it. And then the next paragraph, paragraph 31, is critical. This is probably the last one we'll have. We're approaching 10 minutes to the hour, so we've got about 8 minutes to conclude our program today. So let me see if I can get paragraph 31 in. It's one of those paragraphs that I've marked as being critical. He says in paragraph 31, it will perhaps be objected to this, that if gathering the acorns or other fruits of the earth, etc., makes a right to them, then anyone may engross as much as he will. In other words, the logical implications here is that by mixing my labor with it, it becomes mine. So the implication of that is I can take as much as I want. To which I answer, not so, says Locke. The same law of nature that does by this means give us property does also bound that property too. God has given us all things richly. But how far has he given it to us? To enjoy. As much as anyone can make use of, to any advantage of life before it spoils. So much he may by his labor fix a property in. Whatever is beyond this is more than his share and belongs to others. Nothing was made by God for man to spoil or to destroy. Unquote. My God, what a paragraph. Think of this in terms of climate. Think of this in terms of environmental issues. Polluting water, polluting air, blowing up mountains, denuding forests. It will perhaps be objected to this that if gathering acorns or other fruits of the earth makes a right to them, then anyone may engross as much as he will. To which I answer, not so. The same law of nature that does by this means give us property does also bound that property too. God has given us all things richly. But how far has he given it to us? To enjoy. As much as anyone can make use of, to any advantage of life before it spoils. So much he may by his labor fix a property in. Whatever is beyond this is more than his share and belongs to others. Nothing was made by God for man to spoil or to destroy. And thus, considering the plenty of natural provisions, there was a long time in the world, and the few spenders. And to how small a part of that provision the industry of one man could extend itself, and engross it to the prejudice of others, especially keeping within the bounds set by reason of what might serve for his own use. There could be then little room for quarrels or contentions about property so established. In other words, what Locke is saying here is that man is limited to only what he can use and what will not spoil. That means that there'll be plenty left for everybody else. And the plenty left for everybody else is the qualifier. Locke is saying that what makes private property legitimate is the fact that taking it does not negatively impact other people. The implication being, if it does, then he can't have it. Then reason says he can't have it. I ask you, as we approach the end of our program, we're at 54 minutes after the hour, I ask you to think about inequality. I ask you to think about the 1%. More specifically, I ask you to think about the 1/10 of 1%. I ask you to think about, in Bernie Sanders' numbers, the 1% who control as much wealth in this country as the bottom 90%. My God. In the name of John Locke, what have we done? What are we doing? Not only what are we doing to the world, what are we doing to the people of the world? Locke's entire premise was that there was enough left for everybody. Not only enough left, but what was left was as good as what was taken. In other words, there was no detrimental effect on anybody by privatization. The only results were positive, because by privatizing, that particular piece of property was developed. It would become more productive. There would be more available for more people. And that was totally consistent with God's plan. But Locke specifically denies people the right to take more than they can use. Obviously, there are a lot of people that deny people the right. But when John Locke does it, it carries some weight, since John Locke is the philosophical foundation for their right to take it. What we must appreciate here, and I think I think this is a good place to bring it to an end. It seems to me what we must appreciate here is that the philosophical foundation of private property itself in our society is in this chapter of this particular book, this particular treatise on government. Everything that we claim to be true about property, about private property, stems from this particular source. Therefore, when you go to this source and it tells you that many of the things people argue about their right to property are untrue and totally contradictory to what John Locke says, we need to know that. But up until now, we've depended on them to tell us because they got the education. But they ain't going to tell us. So we damn well better start finding out for ourselves. Thus the case for educational reform, for educational revolution in this country. I believe that this is so important. And I feel honored to have the opportunity to find it, to research it, and to share it with you here on the Virtual Center. What a blessing. At this point in my life, after I've stopped teaching, after I've retired, to be able to do this, to be able to feel this fulfilled is an honor, and I thank you all for it. I think probably that's the end of our program. We're at 58 minutes after the hour. Let me encourage, if you are in the southeastern part of the United States, you got a pretty good day. I don't know if it's going to continue, but I hope that you will enjoy the rest of the day. But the fact of the matter is, all of us every day is a good day. I hope that you will enjoy it. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Be kind to each other. Be safe. And I hope that you'll be able to come back and join us again here at the Virtual Center. I want to thank Bob Kincaid and the folks at Head On, the Head On Radio Network, for the opportunity to bring these programs to you. And in this season, I especially want to encourage you to do whatever you might be able to do to keep these programs on the air. I thank you. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Be kind to each other. And Lord willing, we'll be back together again tomorrow. Thank you.